My name is Oliver and I'm a family therapist here in Los Angeles. I love working in family systems, thinking in family systems, and teaching people about family systems. I've been working with families and teens for most of my career, mainly in residential treatment settings, but also here in my private practice. Most recently, I was the clinical director of an adolescent treatment center, and I developed this program that uses systems perspectives to help the families and teens that we were working with. Using family systems for me has been a game changer, not only in the results that I deliver the families that I work with, but also in my confidence and my abilities to help families. So whether you're new to working with families or you just need a refresher on how to think systemically, hit subscribe, come join an alliance with me, and let's talk family systems. One of the reasons why I'm drawn towards structural family systems is that it gives me this awesome tool called family mapping to help visualize what is going on in the family. And for me, when I can see what is going on, when I can sort of map it out either physically or in my head, then it gives me so much more confidence to know what I'm doing, and it gives me direction on how to handle things in the case. So hopefully I'm not the only one with this kind of weird brain and you find it useful, because I'm going to demonstrate what I mean, and I would love for you to come along and see what I'm all about. I want to start off by mapping out what is going on between me and you right now. Because you're on YouTube, there's a barrier between us, a real emotional distance. I never get to know who you are. I don't know how many times you've seen this video. I don't know if you're going to come back. There's a real emotional distance there that I'm going to represent on my diagram. There's also other kinds of distancing factors between us as well. I'm recording this in August, but it could be December or January when you watch this. We've got a chronological distance between us and a geographical distance between us. I'm based in West Hollywood right now, but you could literally be anywhere in the world. Family mapping is simple insofar as people are just boxes or squares. So unlike genograms, which are a bit more complicated and have a sort of key that you have to remember, all you have to remember for family mapping is boxes. So I'm going to draw me like this, and then when it comes to you, there's a couple of things I want to discuss. There's one more element that we need to factor into this diagram, and it's very important to remember this in family work and couples work, and that is power. We could argue that you have a lot of power and that you can turn off and find another video at any time. This is true. But for the sake of this argument, let's pretend I'm the only video there is on structural family systems, or you're a captive audience. In which case, I have considerable more power or influence right now, and that is because I've got something that you hopefully want, some knowledge or ideas. I might also have more experience than you. I might even have set myself up at the start to be an authority on the subject. All of these things, as well as the lack of interaction that YouTube provides us, means that I've got a bit more power than you. So I'm going to draw you as a smaller box, and no offense is meant here. And hopefully I've got more than 6 people watching this video, so I'll add a few next to you to represent the other people that have watched this. Now, you might disagree entirely with what I'm doing right now, and that is fantastic and fine and encouraged. Unlike genograms, which are all fact-based and data-driven, family mapping allows more of a subjective experience to come through. So maybe you don't experience me as having more knowledge than you, in which case your diagram is going to look very different from mine. The only person that this has to make sense to is you, and you have to be able to explain it as well. So for that reason, I love how creative family mapping is, and later in this video I hope you get to see how useful it is as well as personal. Another element that I want to capture in this diagram is boundaries. One of the reasons why I chose to use teaching as an example to highlight family mapping is that there's so many juicy rules of engagement here, and boundaries, at least in structural systems, represent who's in what group and what the rules of engagement are. Teaching has these sort of very implicit rules that we're all aware of but probably never actually think about. So what I mean by that is no matter what the teaching event is, we're going to follow the same cultural rules. And that is the understanding that the teacher's going to have more to say than us. So they talk more, we're more quiet. In some situations, we're going to put the teacher on a pedestal, literally, like on a stage, or raise them or elevate them somehow. We might even shine some spotlights on them. Even aliens visiting from another civilization would be able to go, ooh, that person doing the talking with the lights on him is in a different category from the people in the dark who are listening, or not saying as much. How I represent that in my visualization is by the use of lines that represent boundaries. And where there's a very clear or harsh boundary, I'm going to use a double line. So in this YouTube example, teaching over YouTube, I'm going to make sure that it's very clear that I feel very disconnected from you by using 2 lines. At some point in the future, I'm going to be doing a live version of this for therapists at Evolve Treatment Centers and Insight IOP. Quick side note, these are excellent resources to have if you are looking for intensive outpatient treatment centers or residential treatment centers for teenagers. I put the links in the bio below. They're excellent. Highly recommend them both. The visualization or the map of this arrangement is going to be very different from the one that I just did on YouTube. Physically, I'll be closer to them. I'll be in the same room. There's going to be more interaction between us, so I'm going to change that boundary a little bit to be more healthy. I still have some influence or power as a teacher and somebody with experience, so I'm going to retain that. But I tend to see them as colleagues versus students, and I think the size of the boxes is going to change to represent that. I'm going to give you one more example, so we've got 3 ideas to compare to. And this last one is my nightmare class in grad school, where the teacher would show up and say, "Hey kids, what do you want to learn today?" There was a 90-minute class that was chaos of people talking over each other. There was no direction. There was no sort of learning objectives. It was a nightmare. To be fair, it was a lot of fun, but I don't think I learned a lot from it. So the diagram that I draw for this is going to be different again. It was very casual. Those boundaries were very different. The power was off as well. The hierarchy wasn't nearly as clear as it has been in some of the other diagrams. What we're talking about is how structure and organization of a group impacts its performance. So in terms of getting the task done, yes, you can learn some stuff off YouTube, but it's probably not quite as good as in person. And for me, at least, a very informal structure of a class just didn't work. There's no one right way of doing it. All of these different versions of delivering a class work for some people. But in general, we all agree that there needs to be a bit of organization, a bit of a hierarchy, and some boundaries and rules. And the whole point of this is the same is exactly true for families. Without structure, without organization, without boundaries, rules, hierarchy, leadership, and power, family doesn't do so well. And when it doesn't have these elements in place, then we start seeing dysfunction and symptoms showing up, and then the family comes to us. So an organization might have a goal or a purpose of treating teenagers or saving pandas or making shampoo. Families' purposes are a little more nebulous, but they do have a task, and that is simply to get them through the life cycle stages and to adapt to change as it comes up. The founder of structural family systems is Salvador Minuchin, and his whole idea was that a family needs some structure, some organization, some leadership in order for it to be healthy. And whenever we see dysfunction or symptoms show up in a family, it's because one of these things is off. Some aspects of structure and organization that we know to have an impact on performance are things like leadership, hierarchy, roles, communication, and support. Hierarchy implies that someone's in charge and that there are people in roles below them. And that also implies that there's somebody who's got a leadership role, whose vision we're following, or somebody who is taking on more responsibility than others. A CEO is a great example of a leader. Without Oprah, there is no Harpo Productions. And within a company, there are roles. There's Jenny in accounting, Mark in finance, Communication needs to occur between people in the same subsystem as well as up and down the hierarchy. A company needs to provide support, whether it's emotional, financial, benefits. And this, again, the same is sort of true for a family, right? In reverse order, we need to feel support from our family. We need to feel loved and wanted and included. We need to have good communication within families, and this is a big one for us therapists. Obviously, we're looking at the ways people communicate. Roles in a family are important, and we'll go into this later, but we don't want to get stuck in a role. I'm in a role right now of teaching, but I don't want to be a teacher when I go home at the end of the day. We need to be able to move in and out of roles. When we get stuck, that's when symptoms start showing up and dysfunction occurs. With regards to leadership and hierarchy, there's just one basic rule, and that's that we don't want kids in a leadership role above adults, and we don't want them too far up the hierarchy where they're making decisions and influencing the family in age inappropriate ways. So when I was in grad school, I think I got these concepts, right? I think I understood about hierarchy and family mapping and boundaries and things like that. But it was only when I started working with families and seeing families that did not have these things in place did it all start making sense. So I want to spend a few minutes discussing what it looks like, or what, in my experience, what it looks like when a family shows up in your treatment room without leadership or with poor communication. Leadership is usually divided between two parents, but sometimes, and depending on culture and circumstances, it isn't always the case. And of course, there are plenty of single parent households with one leader that are very successful. I would highly encourage you to assess for leadership, which we'll get to in a minute, because there may well be a grandparent or an aunt that is the leader of the family that doesn't live with the people in the room with you, and you need to determine if they are needed in treatment too, which they probably are. I tend to think of leadership as being the glue that holds a family together. And what I see sometimes in a family that lacks a leader is an increase in emotional distance. It's like the family sort of disintegrates a little bit without a leadership. There are quite a few families that I've worked with who have not had a leadership position in the family, and it seemed that the symptoms of the IP, who was a teenager, had the function of bringing the family together. So it's like the teenager's symptoms were doing the job of what a leader who's an adult or a parent should be doing. And in another family that I worked with, there was so much emotional distance and silence in the room that it felt like, they might be living in the same house, but they may as well be sleeping in different cities. Or if they were a zoo, they'd all be in different enclosures. It was a really sad, disconnected feeling that I got as part of my countertransference. Salvador Minuchin and his team had very specific thoughts on what the hierarchy of a family should look like. And 60 years later, it hasn't changed too much, although I think today we are very cognizant of co-creating that ideal hierarchy for a family to respect, cultural and religious beliefs, which is so important. The idea of going in with what we know best is very different from any other modality that I work in, and can be a bit jarring to some therapists. But all we're saying really with this ideal hierarchy is that we prefer adults to be in charge and kids to not be in charge. So what we're looking at here is a family of four, and you'll notice that the parents are in two subgroups. And we separate out subgroups for the parents to account for the adult relationship and their roles as parents. This is really useful when you're working with blended families or families in which maybe grandma or an aunt is very involved in parenting. What I see in the room when the hierarchy is off is a lot of acting out behavior. That can include anything from running away to sometimes self-harm to taking drugs, using oppositional behaviors. And when the kids' symptoms are going outwards, that's an externalizing symptom. And for me, that's always an indicator that there is something off in the hierarchy. Another family that I work with told me that their 9-year-old still sleeps in the same bed as them at night. And maybe that's appropriate in some cultures and certain socioeconomic conditions, but generally that's not developmentally appropriate. And sure enough, this kid was acting out both at home and in school. So in this case, you can imagine this 9-year-old had left the sibling subgroup and gone all the way up to the adult subgroup. So that's what I mean by a hierarchy disturbance. You can move these kids up and down, and that's what was going on. We'll see more in a bit. Roles are meant to be fluid and to change with time. And if a family is to get stuck in roles, it means that they haven't successfully adapted to some change, internal or external, that's going on. And if you remember the task of a family or the purpose of a family, one of those components is to actually adapt well to changes. So some dysfunction or symptoms will show up when people get stuck in roles. Some of the issues that I see in families is where children have become adultified or parentified. So they've been put into a role that they are not equipped for, and there's some dysfunction and symptoms as a result. One of the kids that I'm thinking of came in very, very depressed, having been adultified for a number of years, looking after their younger siblings. When a parent gets stuck in the role of being the super parent or, the helicopter parent, I tend to see a lot of built up resentment and frustration in them. And they are usually so fixed on being the best parent that they can be that they often struggle to see things systemically, which can be particularly challenging for therapists. When a family comes to me and tells me that they have issues with communication they would like to work on, I think to myself that they're really asking for help around conflict and conflict resolution. Family that is saying that communication is off is saying really that they don't know how to repair relationships, they don't know how to work through conflict in a healthy way. This is particularly evident in high conflict families. They just don't have the tools to work through or communicate what's going on, and it results in hurt feelings, and then those hurt feelings produce more conflict, and that conflict produces even more hurt feelings. And because there's no repair, this is just an endless cycle, and resentment builds and builds and builds. So this is, family that's really prickly and explosive. Before we dive into making a family map, I want to distinguish the differences between genograms and family maps. And I love a good genogram. I'm often sketching one out in my intakes just to collect all of the data in one place. I find them extraordinarily helpful. They are very different from family maps though. So although family maps do contain some data and information in it, genograms are data and information heavy. It is all about collecting dates, who got divorced when, who died when, how old is the step cousin. It's data, and the idea of a genogram is it's analyzing data from previous generations. So we're looking for generational patterns. A family map is less concerned with data, although it is part of a family map, and more concerned with dynamics around a problem right now. It's only really about the immediate family members and the interactions that go on between them. Often a family map is about a specific symptom or problem in the family, whereas a genogram is much broader and could go in any number of different directions, collecting generational data on triangles or conflict or cutoff. There's very little room in a genogram for the therapist's subjective experience. It's more about numbers and data. I think family maps have much more room for my experience, what I felt in the room, and I'm going to look at that and determine how much of it is my personal stuff and how much of it is objective countertransference. So it is more data and quantitative, more quantitative. Quantitative? Quantitative. It's more to do with numbers. Although I'm a huge fan of family maps, it's not without its limitations. A family map lacks detail, it's very generalized, it's static, and doesn't really account for change over time. That being said, I think it's a great tool for capturing family dynamics in the moment, especially the ones that you want to work on in therapy. I know I run the risk here of confusing the hell out of everyone because I use family maps in 3 different ways. I use them for my own conceptualization, which is what we're talking about mainly here.
And all you need for that is just pen and paper.
I also use them in group supervision when I'm supervising therapists and I want them to present a family, so I'll have them present using a family map. And the final way that I use a family map is actually as an intervention with a family. I get them to create their own family map. It works so well. I find that teenagers and kids love being able to show what they feel over using their words. So given the opportunity, they will jump on trying to show you where mum and dad are on their map, or where they are.
What I'm showing you on the screen now are the instructions that I use for group supervision. And if you download the handout that accompanies this, it's mypeoplepatterns.com/family systems. I'll give you all the different variations of instructions so you have everything.
I throw in a couple more things to make it more exciting for families and sometimes group supervision. To save me time, I've got these colored envelopes that I use that are really helpful. The instructions are pretty simple. I have a coffee table in my office, and families move things around on the coffee table until it feels right for them.
We've already covered that squares are people, but you can also use triangles.
Triangles represent places, institutions, or things. One example that we'll look at later, where one of the triangles we used was for success. This family had a lot of connection to success. I've used different colored pieces of card, or different colored pens, or different color envelopes in this case. And sometimes it's useful to sort of process why they chose red for dad or blue for themselves. You can get more out of it if you can process these things, which is what we're here to do. I try and give a variety of sizes of these squares and triangles because I want to give my clients in the room, or therapists in the room with me, freedom to express themselves fully. So I will tape up two envelopes together, cut them in half, fold them up, whatever I need to do to be able to give people the tools to express how they're feeling or how they visualize what's going on. Another layer that I use is bits of string to mark boundaries. The final piece is connections between people, and I use bits of tape for that.
I'm pretty sure by now you know exactly how to make a family map, but let's look at how to use them clinically in the first session so that it can potentially inform your treatment plan and directives for the family after the first session. Before meeting the family for the first time, a structural therapist uses all the information they have to form a pre-session hypothesis. And the idea is that when you start working with a family, you can't ask them what their structure is. It's not like a family will say, oh, we need help because our hierarchy is inverted. We need to get asking the right questions, form a family putting map, together a hypothesis, and then testing that hypothesis out is how you get to the correct family structure. So gathering as much data as possible right from the start is really important and needs to be a priority. I love going into my first session with a plan, and that is one of the main benefits of coming up with the pre-session hypothesis. It guides my questions in the first session. It prepares me so that, my time is spent effectively. And because I've not met the family yet, I'm more willing to throw it away if I'm wrong. That's really the zen of hypotheses. You try something, if it sticks, great, and if not, you go back to the drawing board. Collecting information for your pre-session hypothesis starts with the first phone call. And if you're in residential or an IOP, you have this much easier because you get given an intake sheet with all of this information on. However, if you're just working from private practice like me, that first phone call is really important for you to get as much information as possible. Ages, names, dates, where people live, who's in the household, what the problem is. I create a genogram on the first call to consolidate all of the information that I get in one place. So the mother called, in this particular case, she's in her late 40s. There's a father who's in his mid 60s, and they have two kids, a boy who's 14 and a girl who is 20. I find out on the call that the sister is normally out of state at college, but she's back for the summer, and the main problems are with the male child who's 14. He's been smoking weed, missing curfew, and getting into a lot of conflict with mom. After the call, I'm going to think about what my pre-session hypothesis is, and I ask myself a bunch of questions like who called, what was the narrative of the problem. I'm going to think about family life cycle stages, ages of the family members, and most importantly, I think perhaps is why are they calling now? What happened recently? A lot of this information goes in my bubble, and if you don't have a bubble, you need to get one. Mine is bright pink, and it is where I store information that may or may not be necessary at some point. And I'm going to pull things down out of the bubble as I play with things in my mind until I come up with the hypothesis. So the symptoms of this child are acting out. We've got drug use, missing curfew, and conflict with mum. And whenever there's acting out, I'm thinking of the hierarchy and what the imbalance is. And just to clarify, when a teenager acts out with behavioral issues, we call that externalizing. And when they keep their feelings inside, like depression, maybe that would be an internalizing problem. When it comes to hierarchy problems, one of the most common things you'll see is a soft hard split. So one parent is good cop or the pushover, and the other one is the tough mean cop. And a quick look at the genogram shows that mum and the IP have a lot of conflict, so I'm going to guess that mum is bad cop. My family map already has a lot of information that I want to capture. If mum and dad are on different pages, one being good cop, the other being bad cop, there's distance between them that I want to represent. I'm also going to put the IP closer to dad, further away from mum to represent him feeling closer to the good cop. I'm curious to know what is going on between mum and dad and why they're not on the same page. Whenever there's a soft hard split like this with one parent being good cop and the other being bad cop, it could be a result of there being some conflict in the parent subsystem. So mum and dad just aren't on the same page with parenting rules and consequences. Or it could be something going on in the adult subsystem, something in their marriage that they aren't discussing that keeps them on opposite pages like this. So it would be important for me to explore which one of these it is, whether it's just a parenting thing or something deeper in their relationship. When you've got so much distance between two parents, it's impossible for them to keep healthy boundaries between the parent subsystem and the sibling subsystem. In order for you to provide healthy boundaries, you've got to be on the same page, you've got to be talking to each other, you can't have that distance. So healthy boundaries would mean a united front. A slightly alternative version of depicting this would be to have rigid boundaries between mum and the IP and more porous boundaries between dad and the IP. That would make sense to me as well. Either way, though, there are some porous boundaries here, and whenever there are porous boundaries, a kid or a child can rise up into the parent or adult subsystem. And if that goes on for too long, that's when you get an inverted hierarchy. The kid is ruling the family, and they're not equipped for that. They just don't have the tools or skill to be able to lead a family. So they rule by using the only tools that they have, which is usually a lot of shouting, yelling, bribing, blackmailing, threatening. So going back to my hypothesis, one of the questions that I'm asking myself is about the age and the life cycle. I noticed that dad is a bit older than mum, and I'm curious about that. Is he retired? Is he still working? And how did that impact everything that we've talked about so far? My hypothesis so far is that there's a bit of an alliance or a coalition between dad and the IP, and that might be because he's the youngest son. It might be that dad's retired and has more time to spend with him. We're not quite sure, but it doesn't matter because it's just a hypothesis that we're going to check out in the future. My family map is going to include the conflict between mom, and I'm drawing her a little bit bigger than dad because dad's so far not really in the picture. I haven't heard a lot about him. And mom is the one that calls. She seems to have a lot of power and she's the one butting heads with her son. And I'm not including the sister because I don't really know where she fits in yet. Okay, this is how I know I'm a family systems nerd because now I'm super excited for my first session. I've got a whole bunch of information and a lot of questions that need answering. So, this is where Angela Caldwell, one of the great family systems teachers in LA, tells us to put our lab coats on. So, as well as being therapists, we have to be observing the behaviors of the family as if we were scientists in lab coats. So the first session comes and I'm armed with this idea of what I think is going on, and I have questions that I need to ask to fill in the gaps. The first thing I'm going to notice is how do they enter the room? Are they nervous? Are they quiet? Are they loud? Are they on time? Are they late? This is all information that might help me factor in how to change my hypothesis or if I'm sticking with it. Structural family therapists pay a lot of attention to where people sit because the understanding is that the family is going to show us their structure in unconscious ways. So I'm paying attention to where people sit on these sofas. If the IP sits in between his parents, that's very different from sitting alone on a sofa by themselves. If this were a real case and I felt confident in my hypothesis, I would bet money on the fact that dad and the IP would sit next to each other. Often people in a coalition or an alliance sit next to each other, away from the person that they're sort of turning against. Still don't know what's going on between mum and dad, so I'm going to pay attention to how they interact. And one of the easy ways to do this is to think of the John Gottman Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and I'd be looking for stonewalling, contempt, criticism, and defensiveness. There's all kinds of things I don't know about power in this family. Has mum got it? Has the IP got it? I'm not sure. I'm going to be paying attention to behaviors in the room. If the IP's got the power in the family, he's probably going to be sulky and drawing attention from me, mum, and dad. If it's mum, she might be running the show. Assuming that one of the parents in the room has the most power, it's important to spend time building an alliance with that person because they write the checks and decide if they're coming back or not the following week.
I'm definitely assessing a family for enmeshment, and I've got 8 signs of enmeshment that I'm looking for in the room when I'm working with a family for the first time. You can download it at mypeoplepatterns.com/family systems.
The most common signs of enmeshment that I see are people speaking on behalf of each other. So, a parent jumping in to answer a question that I aim at the IP, and using we versus I. So, parents saying, we feel that this is a great match for us, when actually I want them to speak for themselves. And I'll correct them and ask them to do that.
I think you guys are more than ready now to create your own family map. So what we're going to do is watch a scene from The Incredibles 2 where the family has dinner together. And I found the interactions that they have so realistic, it's perfect for family systems training. Go grab pen and paper and watch the clip and create a family map based on the scene. On the other side of the video, I'll show you what I did and you can sort of follow along and see where you're at.
A little side note on enactments. Watching a family interact like this as if we're not there is called an enactment, and we would try and recreate something like this in therapy with an activity or a discussion topic or just watching the family do their thing. There were 3 standout moments in this clip that made me think of family systems, and I could already envision the family map as I was watching this. Violet asks her brother a couple of times in a couple of different ways to wash his hands, and that made me think of her as being a parentified child. And if she's not parentified, she is certainly overstepping her mark as a sibling, because that sounds an awful lot like what a mum should be saying. And remember, a family isn't able to tell us their structure, we're inferring the structure from interactions just like this. There's a bit of a familiar dynamic now in the next clip, and I can see there being a lot of conflict between mom and dad taking Violet's side a lot. This is going to show up in my map in terms of the relationship lines. Violet's basically getting dad to side with her against mom in this. This is quite a common dynamic that really makes a hierarchy imbalanced. So I'm going to put Violet closer to dad and Violet against mom. The fact that dad didn't take mum's side means that there's some boundary issues again. That allows Violet to have more power than she should, as mum and dad are not on the same page with regards to this superhero thing. And it clearly is a parenting issue and an issue between them personally. So there's conflict in the adult and parent subsystem. I think this is something that Violet exploits. So this was not a good idea to have that conflict in front of her, because she's going to take advantage of that whenever she can. So based on just a 2-minute viewing of this family, you can already get a lot of information to put in your family map. You need to sort of watch them over time, obviously, to make sure it's right. But when you compare it to the ideal family map, putting the two side by side gives you an outline of what the work is in treatment. So to work out the treatment plan, all you have to do is figure out the things you need to do to get from one image to the other. Some of the things that stand out to me are Violet's central role, the hierarchy stuff, the parent conflict, boundaries, and, getting Violet and Dad a little less enmeshed with each other. This is looking dangerously like a transgenerational coalition against a parent. I know. There are signs that Dad and Violet are in a coalition against Mom. Now, this is particularly dangerous to families, and there's some empirical evidence out there that supports the idea that the teen in this situation is more likely to become a substance user. So I want to jump on this straight away if this family were my clients. There might be some signs that there's this soft hard split between mum and dad again. So I would want to address that by getting mum and dad on the same page with regards to their parenting of Violet, and they're in desperate need of a conversation to get on the same page about this whole superhero thing, I'd also help them see the systemic pattern that goes on when one parent is easy on a kid, the other one makes up for it by being tougher, and this repeats the cycle. I'd want to help the family toughen up their boundaries so that the hierarchy gets a bit clearer. So, if I was in a session with this family, one of the structural techniques I would use would be to block or restrain Violet from acting like a parent in front of me. And I would highlight this to mum and dad in an attempt to get them to see that it's not healthy when a kid acts like a parent. Alright, I hope that gave you a great insight into family mapping, and if you want to know more, sign up for our mailing list and I will keep you in the loop every time I put a new systems training video up, and I look forward to hearing from you.